I started out doing research on leadership, but more on extraordinary, charismatic, visionary types of leadership, so the big leaders. And I wanted to understand why they have such a powerful motivational effect on others. And they do, followers tend to identify with them and tend to make that vision their own. It gives meaning to their work to know what they're doing it for. So they're trying to build a better future together, and that's a very powerful form of leadership. However, if you look in history, you also see very negative examples of that type of leadership. For example, when the ethics of that particular person or the way that they are striving for certain things is less than what you would want, morally speaking. Also, these leaders tend to polarize tremendously, so some people tend to love them and other people tend to hate them. And that's because they often don't agree with the aims and the intentions of those leaders. So when we also looked in practice and started to see all of these ethical failures in big businesses, the financial sector and whatnot, I started to realize that besides the grand, strong forms of leadership, it would also be very important to understand more about ethical and unethical forms of leadership, and perhaps also how organizations could curb these unethical effects that leaders might have. The dark side of leadership, there are very many examples of what that could look like. One, and I guess that's the most studied one, is abusive forms of leadership. When leaders are rude, overly critical, hostile, belittling their employees, taking credit for what they have achieved. But other forms might include being overly domineering or taking undue credit, over-controlling, or perhaps things like practicing favoritism. One of the more important ways that I've been looking at it is to look at two different traits of leaders, so more personality based, and that is to look at Machiavellianism and narcissism and how these two play out in leadership. Both have contribute quite strongly to leader emergence, so people tend to go into leadership roles more easily when they have these traits, but over time this becomes a problem. Now, Machiavellians are extremely goal-driven people, and they're not necessarily always immoral, but they are amoral. They don't care about the means. They'll do anything to achieve their goals, and that includes lying and cheating and treating others badly if that gets them what they want. They don't necessarily do bad things, but they will if they feel they will be rewarded for it. So you can see that that might be a problem if people come into leadership positions with that. And, well, narcissists, I guess we know a little bit more about that trait. Narcissists love to love themselves. They have a preoccupation with themselves. They have a sense of grandiosity, of entitlement. And they have a very inflated self-view, so they think they're much better than they actually are. They also tend to be quite exploitative because they think they're entitled to more than others will be entitled to. So they do tend to treat people quite badly over time. They seem entertaining and confident at first, but over time we tend to get to know them as more arrogant and quite ruthless. The obvious problem of having leaders high on narcissism or Machiavellianism rise through the ranks is, of course, that these traits bring with them tendencies to be unethical directly, and that will harm the organization and others. Both are likely to exploit others if it gains them something. They're often seen as abusive leaders, for instance. And also, as I said, narcissists tend to seem attractive in the short run, but over the longer run tend to lose their appeal. And one study by some colleagues of mine in Amsterdam even showed that team members perceived their narcissistic leaders to be more effective, whereas if you looked at objective performance, they actually harmed that. So these teams were actually underperforming, and the reason was that these narcissistic leaders undermined the communication and the free sharing of ideas in the team because they needed to be so central all the time. So that is part of it. But beyond this, the leaders tend to be very powerful role models. So when others see that their leaders are acting unethically, cutting corners, cheating, lying, exploiting others, they might signal to their followers that this is an okay way of dealing with people, and you start creating a whole climate which is of course quite damaging in the firm. I think if you've seen the Enron movie depicting how they did things over there, you see a very good example of how this sort of behavior trickles down into an organization. And if you look at narcissists, you sort of see the same way. One of the studies we did is that we saw that, we looked at employee self-promotion. Now, self-promotion is a rather boasting style of impression management, and where you're constantly saying how great you are, what you've accomplished, etc. This is not something the normal population is overly sensitive to, but narcissists actually endorse this, and they do this themselves, but they also like it in others. So basically, in a way, they encourage people to be more narcissistic themselves, and that means that narcissists end up rewarding narcissist-like behaviors such as self-promotion, even when performance and true accomplishments do not reflect what you're boasting about. And that could, of course, end up being very damaging for the organization. The dark side traits vary naturally in the population, so they might be slightly more prevalent among leaders, but they are also seen among employees. And I typically study normal levels, so not clinical levels of these traits. Of course, there are also really clinical levels of these traits. But there are several studies that suggest that that in the normal population, narcissism is on the rise, at least in Western societies. And just as an example, we recently did some work looking at Machiavellian employees, and these Machiavellian employees were, like their leaders, making unethical choices. For example, they were withholding important knowledge from colleagues. They decided to help them less than their non-Machiavellian counterparts, and they also engaged in emotional manipulation of their leaders. So they were trying to do anything that was within their power, which might be slightly different than the power of the leader, but they're still doing anything within their power to gain their goals. Now, I'm not saying that a little bit of narcissism or a tiny little bit of Machiavellianism is always bad. There's something good about wanting to strive for goals, about being a little bit confident. But of course, when it comes to be excessive and it becomes overconfidence or cheating to get to your goals, then of course we're crossing a line and we're in trouble in organizations. Now, there are many different ways in which respondents or in which employees can respond to leader behavior. One trait that we, for example, recently studied in relation to narcissism was follower self-esteem. So are people who have a stronger sense of self-worth perhaps better able to deal with these types of more abusive leaders? And indeed we found that people who are low on self-esteem suffer much more abuse. So they perceive their narcissistic leaders to be more abusive. Now, there's probably two reasons for that. One is that they are actually easier victims, so they might actually also be bullied more by these types of leaders because of their lack of confidence and their stronger need for leadership. The other is that they might also be more sensitive to criticism and more easily perceive a remark that a leader makes as criticism. So there's probably two reasons for it, but this is an example of one trait that makes a lot of difference in this dark side. And also in that study that I was referring to on Machiavellian followers, we saw with them that they respond quite well to ethical leadership. If their leaders are not very ethical, if they don't explain what they want in terms of morals, what they think is acceptable or not, then we see much more knowledge hiding, much more emotional manipulation than if these leaders are more ethical and clearer on what the norms and values are and how we do things around here. If leaders do that, then there's all of a sudden no difference anymore between Machiavellian and non-Machiavellian followers in those more unethical forms of behavior. So in that sense, both leader and employee characteristics and behaviors affect each other, and I think we need more research on that sort of dance that they do together. An important takeaway from this research area for me is that we shouldn't sit back and think we can't do anything about the dark side in either leaders or followers. Just like the example that I just gave of ethical leadership helping to lessen the negative tendencies of highly Machiavellian employees, organizations can do the same at a higher level. So they can ensure that the way they do things meets ethical standards, and that it is very clear that that is also the norm and that is also what is expected in the organization. So imagine an organization with an excessive competitive organizational climate where all that counts is the bottom line and where cutting corners is actually even encouraged to meet the goals. Then, and you know, also where results are final, but the way we get there is not monitored, then we shouldn't be surprised to see in that organization that people start behaving in that way, that this is really a situation that activates these types of negative traits. So leaders will start cheating, exploiting others, employees will follow suit, hide their knowledge, start to cheat themselves, those types of things. Instead, if you have an organization with a more ethical climate, where it's clear what is expected from employees and managers alike, where leaders are held accountable, where ethical behavior is monitored and rewarded, then we send the signal that the norm is not to cheat and lie to reach goals, and this will not be accepted. And that just lessens the room for these types of traits to come to the fore and makes it much easier to work together in a more cooperative, more ethical fashion.